Tēnā koutou katoa, haere mai ki tēnei hui, ki te mana whenua rangitānei, he mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morning everyone and welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee for December, our final committee meeting for the year. As you're all aware, the meeting is being recorded and live streamed, and we will be having Councillor Bowen join us online shortly. I don't think I need to run through the health and safety requirements, which you're all very familiar with, and we don't have any external people in the chamber today. So we will just obviously be taking a wee bit more time this morning because we'll have submitters presenting to us online and we have got an elected member joining us online. And just a reminder, probably more to staff if you're answering a question to give your name first. So first up, we'll call for apologies. We've got an apology from Councillor Finlay, Councillor McCullagh and Councillor Bowen for lateness. Are there any other apologies? Great, well I will move that those are received, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I'll invite you to vote. That is carried 100%. I haven't had notification of any additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? No. We haven't been notified of any public comment, so we're moving on to item 5, page 7, hearing of submissions of the draft support and funding policy. So I will move that the Planning and Strategy Committee hears submissions from presenters who indicated their wish to be heard in support of their submission, and that the committee note the procedure sheet for hearing of submissions as described in the procedure sheet. Seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. So looking to our submissions list, our first submission is from Men's Shed Manawatu, presented by David Chappell. So councillors, this is on page 43. Welcome, David. So you know the drill. Unfortunately, you can't see the traffic light system in front of us, so I will just let you know when it gets to 10 minutes if you're still presenting, but if you could keep an eye on time as well, that would be great. So we're just getting a little bit of feedback in the room. We'll just double check our sound. But you can take, David, you can take your submission as read. Obviously, the 10 minutes is yours to use how you wish though, but if you would like questions from elected members, you'll just need to factor that into your 10 minutes, though you're familiar with the process, so. And you can start when you're ready.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. And I say thank you to the staff who have accommodated me here this morning in the main building so that I can present to you. Just 3 points I wanted to make in relation to our submission. First one was that the proposed rentals that you've got are very much in line with what we are paying as a tenant in the Rangitāne Pavilion. But the point I really wanted to make was that it sounds very attractive for the rental of $500 odd, or $600 I think is proposed for a building of the size that we have. But by the time we pay rates of $300, insurance of nearly $1,000, and horizon rates of $230, our actual rental, if you like, the net outgoings are over $2,000. And I think that should be made quite clear to people who are looking at those figures, that it's much more than just the rental itself. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point is that they're, from our particular point of view, they're based on area. And as most people know, we are looking to add to our building and almost doubling the size. So what I couldn't see anywhere was, once it's done, what our rental would be based on. And as we've undertaken to raise the money for the addition, we're hoping that it will be based on the existing area and not the extended area. So that's the second point I wanted to make from that, and it's not clear in there what it is. I think also I just want to reinforce the point that it's very good to have a system where you can see what the basis of any rental or any assistance is, but there also needs to be some flexibility. And being from Menshed, which is rather on the left field of some things, we really felt it took us some time, for council officers particularly, to understand what we were about, and it needs to be some flexibility in assessing the rentals. If we hadn't had that first lease from the council, we wouldn't have been able to get cracking, and we wouldn't have been established. And there was a leap of faith, I think, from some people that we were really genuine and able to carry on our work. So I think it's important that you don't close the door to people who may be slightly different from what is anticipated or the norm. We can't just work in an office with a desk, as some people might do. And the third point I wanted to make this morning was just in relation to the assistance to the Menshed for our additions. I have in front of me the annual budget. It says from 2017-18, and it says, if I can quote it, the council will investigate costings to upgrade Menshed Manawatu toilets and modify internal walls and construct an outdoor shelter to be considered as part of the 2018 to 2028 10-year plan. And my question really to the council is, has that been investigated? And if so, was it not successful? If it hasn't been investigated, can we please do so, because we're getting to the pointy end of what we want to do, and we need to know where we're heading. So that's my 3 points this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, David. First question is from Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, David. It's actually a question for Anne-Marie. I see she's online. I just wondered, Anne-Marie, could you answer the question on the...
Sorry, Councillor, we're taking questions just for submitters.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Chair.
Are there any other questions for David? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, David, for your submission. Just when you mentioned the rates that you're paying, is that taking into account a rates rebate, or do you not apply for a rates rebate?
No, we haven't, and it doesn't take that into account. We pay the council rates, which are $300, and we pay Horizons rates, which are $230. So I'm not aware of any opportunity for a rebate on that.
Okay, I might catch up with you later about that offline. Thank you.
Okay, be very pleased.
Thank you, David. There's no further questions for you today. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Our next submission is from the Palmerston North Community Services Council. We've got Tim Kendrew and Emma O'Shea presenting, and this is on page 58.
Okay.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, kia ora koutou. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. 3 areas we're focused on for our submission: the Community Development Small Grants Fund and the Partnerships with Sector Lead proposal, part of the SPG, and the community occupancies. We've got a few points of each of those. We've learned from our last submission not to spend a whole allocation talking with no time for questions, so we're learning as we go. The Community Development Small Grants Fund, so our points here, well, we've been distributing this fund, CSC has, since 1984 on behalf of the City Council. We're pleased to see our role formalised in this proposed policy. The parts we are concerned about, we're concerned about the support priority that the fund would be for groups which do not receive other forms of operational funding. Most community groups receive some form of support from the council, for example, rates remissions or the community occupancy. They're receiving these different forms of support because they need all the inputs they can to operate and to continue to provide services for the benefit of the city. Another point, we don't agree with increasing the maximum amount to $10,000 for this fund, unless you'd like to double the amount available in the SGF pot. Obviously, we'd be supportive of that. Tim.
Cool. For the strategic priority grant, focusing on the sector leads proposal, we're very supportive of that proposal for partnerships with sector lead organisations, with we hope organisations like us. From our perspective, the primary benefits of those partnerships would be longer term security of funding, a more streamlined approach to our funding and reporting, and the opportunity to have better dialogue with the council, including being able to share the great work that's happening across the community sector to address community needs, the ways we can work together on future challenges and opportunities. We understand the reason that initially it's proposed to come out of the SPG fund, but we hope that in future budgets money could be allocated specifically to these sector lead partnerships. We also just want to point out that some of our funding, and we assume some other organisations in a similar boat, come from other budget lines already. It's not all from the SPG. For example, for us, we have the contract to manage Hancock House. We have a contract to deliver small grants. And we get money from the Community Training Fund on an ad hoc basis. And all of those happen in kind of different timetables at the moment, and we hope they could all be included in a partnership so that it was all kind of streamlined. But we wouldn't want that money to be coming from the SPG pot.
That's right. Regarding the community occupancies, we're supportive of this community occupancy being included in the plan. Our only concern with this section is that Part A requires reporting for all of the council support. Therefore, that would, in theory, be the community occupancies as well. That would be a new requirement, as the outcomes from occupancies, tenancies, for example, at Hancock House, that has not, it's not previously been required to report on outcomes as part of our lease contracts. If reporting is required, we would suggest that organisations' annual reports should provide sufficient information about the work that they are doing and the benefits to the community. Overall, we're grateful for the council's support for the Community Services Council and the community sector in general. We know that we're lucky to have a council, a city council, that is supportive of our community sector and understands our needs. Thanks for your time today. We're happy to answer questions.
Thank you for your submission. We do have a couple of questions. First up is Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your submission. You mentioned in there around the $10,000, limit. I was just wanting to understand there, when you allocate the small grants fund to community groups, are you wanting to not do it where you fully fund, ones that are sort of higher priority, I guess, or are you wanting to keep with that sort of pro rata across all eligible organisations?
Don't have a specific view on that aspect. The small grants funds is really vital for many small organisations to be able to pay their administrative costs. We do see that it's good to have tight criteria, and perhaps tighter criteria than have been used in recent years. We think that the decision makers and really the decision makers for the small grants funds are working party, which is made of volunteers with long service in the community sector, and they know what the needs are of the community at that time, and they make decisions about the criteria. And we think that we prefer the pro rata approach. That's generally how it's been at the moment, but there needs to be criteria, and they can be strengthened. I think our thoughts would be to perhaps reduce the pay attention to the income of organisations to make sure that really large organisations weren't accessing this pot. But we think that as the policy stands, the decision makers, if we're allocated, the decision-making process is allocated to us at the Community Services Council. We've got the, what's the word I'm looking for? Not power, but the authority as part of the decision-making process to include the different criteria, which might change from year to year, depending on the needs of the sector, depending on the amount of money that there is to be allocated, depending on how many grants, how many applications are received for that fund. Don't know if that really answers your question, Councillor Dingwall.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen, online.
Morena.
Hi.
Just give me a smile if you can hear me. Excellent, thank you. A couple of questions, but we might not have time. But I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about the issues around multiple funding streams and the reporting that generates, and your suggestion of those being pulled in together. What would be the benefits of that, or do you see any risks to that we should be aware of before making that decision?
I think, just speaking for CSC at the moment, because not everyone obviously has as many contracts to deliver services as we do, but they're all on different timetables, which means that probably more often than not, we're in the process of negotiating some contract or funding agreement with the council. We're redoing the Hancock House contract, and then we're redoing the small grants contract, and then another Hancock House contract because they're only a few months long sometimes, and then just doing an SPG application. So if those were all in one partnership agreement that was on a 3 or a 5 year term, or however long, we'd do it once, and it would all be agreed for the period of time, and then we could just focus on the work, and then come back and do it all again in one go, rather than kind of being on this constant stream of negotiating something. Anything to add?
Yeah, well, just the certainty that the longer the contract we have, the better, really. The SPG one, or the 3 year cycle, was really great. You can get on with that. We know in advance how much we're going to get for the 3 years, and we get on with that work. Negotiating things every 4, 8, 12 months is, it's extra work on both sides, both for the City Council staff and on our side. And mostly the contracts kind of continue on very similar to the previous year. So it's interesting, all the extra work that's done in redoing them. Yeah.
So just to follow up on that, you talked about a more relational reporting arrangement. How would you see that operating?
We don't know exactly how council imagines these partnership agreements, but we would hope that there might be the opportunity to come before you more regularly, whether that's 6 months or every year, and report in a way that we could tell stories rather than and have this question and answer time. We think would be more useful than a list of statistics that we deliver 20 training programs or whatever it is, because that doesn't really tell you the difference that's being made. And it's an issue across the sector, being able to measure and report. But even more so, we think at a kind of sector lead level, where our work is connecting people and building, all this connection across the sector. And how do you measure that? We can't tell you, we introduce 200 people to each other, because we don't know that, and we may not know the outcome of that for 2 years' time. But we feel like it would be great to be able to have this kind of conversation more often as a regular part of the process.
Yeah. Thank you. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Emma and Tim. Just a couple of questions around some parts of your submission that you didn't mention when you were just speaking. Around the foundation tenant issue. I'm not very clear, to be honest, about the priorities that are being given to foundation tenants. Do you have an understanding of what that currently is?
We don't know exactly what that is in relation to. There are at least 2 tenants that were foundation tenants, as in they moved into Hancock House at the start of when it was opened. That's what I'm considering a foundation tenant to be, who no longer are in the building. So we don't think it would be relevant for those organisations to have priority in any kind of new things that were available at Hancock House, any new tenancies. Yes, I don't quite know what that is. We've suggested that perhaps current tenants having a priority might be a better wording, if that was the intention, that this for kind of the community that's currently here to have some priority. The foundation tenant has left me a bit perplexed, actually. That sounds fair summary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we think current tenants, perhaps there could be reason to have them in the support priorities, but the foundation tenants, we're not quite sure what that's there for.
Okay, thank you. Time is up, so I'm not sure if I'll be allowed another question.
We actually have a 20-minute gap for our next submitters, so I'll allow another question.
Well, thank you, being indulged by the chair this morning. So the other question was around your comments about adding rainbow community and other marginalised communities to the list of priority communities. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? Have you had some input from Margaret or anyone else from the rainbow community to add that? And
yes.
A second part of that is, I'm not 100% sure that I'm comfortable with the phrase other marginalised communities, but maybe we can come up with something better.
Well,
I'll own that. I don't know what the best wording is, but...
Yes, we weren't necessarily going to tell you what the wording was, but just to get across that there are other groups there. So the process of how we, this particular idea and or our submission in general, we got our membership together, we advertised that to our members, and we had about 8 to 10 people come to a meeting, and then a draft submission based on ideas from that meeting was sent out to our whole membership of community organisations, and some of those chose to give feedback and others didn't. So this idea of widening the different priority groups came from our membership. Tim, I asked you, did we talk directly with Cameron? It was because he
didn't know.
No. It came from other groups who are working with the gay and lesbian community.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim and Emma. There's no further questions, so thank you for making time for us for your submission this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, councillors, we've had a little bit of a change around with submitters presenting, and there are a couple that have withdrawn. So we are going to just hit pause on submission and move to the minutes, and we will see if we've got more online once we have confirmed the minutes. So looking to page 89, where we have the minutes of the Part 1 public 10th of November meeting, and I will move that those be confirmed as a true and correct record, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments on the minutes? Great, I'll invite you to vote. So those are carried 100%. We're now just going to take a 5-ish minute break while we wait for a couple more people to join us online, and then we will proceed with our submissions. All right, councillors, we will get back into it. So the next submission that we are going to move to is on page 41 from Creative Sound Society, The Stomach, and we've got Harry online who is going to speak to us. So, Harry, you're familiar with the process, but you've got 10 minutes, including your questions, and obviously you're nodding so you can hear us fine. And we could hear a little bit of rustling before, so we can definitely hear you too. And you can just start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for having me this morning and for hearing our views on the proposed policy change. Must say it's a bit of a novelty to be zooming into council, so I'm sure everyone's finding it a bit interesting. I just wanted to speak this morning briefly on the main points from our submission and perhaps elaborate on one or two. In principle, Creative Sounds supports the draft support and funding policy. The principles behind the policy seem appropriate, and we really support the attempt to bring more clarity and consistency to the allocation of funding and resources for community and for-purpose organisations. We also think that the recognition of rental support within this policy is okay, and it's good to see that included, because I think that's been something that's sort of been included on the fringes of decision making in the past, but hasn't been brought to the centre and it hasn't had consistency around it. We'd like to ensure that council clarifies how this is going to be factored into funding decision making processes in future. We see that there are potentially some adverse outcomes for the community sector if this isn't handled properly. For example, there has been a case in the past where there's been inconsistency around the justification for funding decisions for different community organisations, and rental support has been cited as a factor in that decision-making process or justification for declining an organisation's funding. So we're really keen to see that clarified within this policy. And we see that as possibly one of the greatest risks from implementing this in its current state. So we'd urge you to reconsider that and consider clarifying the exact wording of that and ensuring that it is very clear how that should be considered within a decision-making forum. I'd also like to note that we support the key points raised by the Palmerston North Community Services Council, particularly regarding the Community Development Small Grants Fund. I think they had a clause in there about excluding organisations that receive support from council and other forms from being eligible to access that. We support their proposal to change the wording of that so that we maintain the status quo. And I also note their point about reporting requirements for community occupancies, and we too would support their proposal that any reporting on the outcome of a community occupancy shouldn't be more onerous than current reporting standards or agreements with council. And I think the other point that we wanted to raise was that in principle, Creative Sounds supports section 5.6, partnership with sector lead organisations. But in general, we'd note that it seems pretty open-ended, and that there isn't much clarity around what that would look like at this stage or how we would necessarily go about implementing that. And to me, it seems like a nice thought, but it could do with some more elaboration. And perhaps that's something that should be considered at this stage rather than including it and leaving it so open-ended at this point. But having said that, we really welcome any opportunities to further recognise or elevate these key partnerships with the City Council. And I think, it's really exciting that the Council is considering avenues to increase support or cement support for these key organisations that do so much of the work within the community sector. And I think for now, that's all I wanted to speak to. So I'm happy to take any questions or elaborate further on any of those if anyone has questions.
Thank you, Harry. There are some questions. First up, Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Harry. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Hey, I'll just can you just elaborate around your comments that you just made around sort of the sector lead organisations and the funding of that, and that requiring a little bit more rigour?
Sure.
How does it? Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about perhaps get around negative consequences that might come out of that.
I think if something's as open-ended as it is currently, the wording of that section indicates that there might be, that some organisations might enter into a partnership and some funding might be moved from the strategic priority grants, but without a clear process, we're uncertain about how that would happen and whether that's something that we would need to champion with council officers, and whether that would be a fair process for all organisations, including ours. I can see there being risks in terms of some organisations getting in ahead of others, or that process being staggered. And again, the thing we're trying to achieve is to take the uncertainty out of the process and the uncertainty out of the contestable funding. So I'm not certain that this achieves that. However, I do think it is a good step that council is recognising that there is something to do in this space. I'm just not sure that we've nailed it at this point.
Yes. So just to clarify, so I guess oversubscription of that partnership arrangement is a risk in terms of perhaps the remaining allocations of the SPGs. Would that be an accurate assessment?
I would agree in principle, but I'd also add that I think because it's not clearly worded and we don't know exactly how the allocations from the SPG would be made, that there is a risk. If it was done in a particular way, say organisations currently receiving funding from the SPG have that amount moved to these new allocations, there could be ways of handling that, but in its current form, there are some risks involved, and risks for those partnership organisations that we're talking about, and for the rest of the community sector who are trying to draw from the Strategic Priority Grants Fund. The ideal outcome would be that we pump more money into the Strategic Priority Grants Fund and fund these priority organisations through partnerships. I understand that there's pressure there, but that's the ideal outcome that I would seek.
Great, thanks, Harry. Madam Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Harry. I just wanted to further unpack your thinking around the partnerships with sector leads. Could we get your views on how sectors should be identified, and then how leads within sectors should be identified?
Again, I think at this stage, the proposal is it's a great idea, but without entering into a process of actually deciding, what does council see as a priority organisation? What are the sectors? Again, there's not very much clarity there. So I could say I think this and I think that, but I don't think that's adequate. I think we need to actually design a framework and perhaps identify what exists already, and then enter into that. So I wouldn't want to comment exactly on who I think and what I think, and what from Creative Sounds we think should happen at that point.
Thanks. What I've heard there is council leading a process that would give some definition in that space.
Yeah, and
Great.
if it was a consultative process with those organisations, I think that would be good.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Harry. Just a quick question, and correct me if I'm wrong. The sector leads partnership idea, was that not something that Creative Sounds submitted on in the long-term plan?
That's right, yes.
So given that you submitted on it, can you explain what you were hoping to see if this isn't it?
I think in principle, the idea is where we would like to head. However, I think there are some risks inherent to the way it's happening. And so we would want to enter into a process to ensure that we're not creating other adverse effects for the community sector. And I see in other submissions as well from the community sector that some don't think that this is the best approach. I think that the looseness of this doesn't quite serve the ends that we're trying to achieve. But in principle, we support the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, you.
Thank you, Harry, very much for making time to present your submission to us today. Your 10 minutes is concluded.
Thank you very much for having us.
So we're now moving on to submission from Emma Prowse and James Griffiths. I think we've got Emma presenting this. This is on page 81, councillors. So Emma, you've got 10 minutes to present your submission, and we will just monitor the time on our side. Normally you would be able to see our traffic light system, so I'll let you know when your 10 minutes is up. If you would like to provide time for questions, that is within your 10 minutes, and you may start when you're ready.
Awesome, thank you. Kia ora everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Obligatory question over Teams. Yes, so I'm one of the owners of a heritage building in Palmerston North, Category 1 listed building, which is a cottage on Ferguson Street. And we and my husband have been restoring this building for the last now going into 4 years. So it's been a complete rebuild basically of this house, because it's 146 years old, and every time we opened up a wall, it was, that needs new bones. Timber doesn't last forever. It's starting to look really good, and we're just about finished. And as part of that, we've been applying to the heritage grants for the protecting, sorry, I'll get the words, the protecting Palmy's history with the residential buildings. So we've had a couple of grants to help with materials for the build, and it's been really valuable to help the building and the project along. So just my submission is really kind of pro the approach of having support for these heritage buildings, and just calling out a couple of things that would make it difficult under the new policy for sort of individual owners of properties or notable trees to apply for the grant. The part A, it just trying to share my screen here. Here we go, more actions. Whoops, screen share. Maybe. Let's do. No, we'll just talk to it. Sorry, guys. So we've got a couple of things in the new policy that make it difficult for individuals to apply. It's under guidelines, which is number 5, 5.2.1 applicants. I'll read it to you, which is B. All applicants will be required to provide the following evidence. So I read this as, to apply for a grant, I need to provide this. A statement of financial position, including but not limited 2, an audited or reviewed financial accounts and balance sheet. So yeah, I'm not a company. I don't have an accountant myself. I'm my own accountant, and I don't have an auditor. So yeah, to provide that's difficult. And also I wouldn't really want that in kind of the public realm. It's not something I would consider giving to council, which is, you know, a statement about my personal finances. And then it goes on to section 5.3.3 assessment. So when assessing the individual's proposal, to consider, one moment, I'm just reading it out. Where did the moment ago? I'll get there, guys, sorry. Yeah, here we go. Clearly show the applicant's overall financial position, including their ability to support the project, activity, service, or event from their own resources and or access to grants from other sources. Yeah, so I get the intention of what we're trying to do here, which is to make sure that, you know, council funding goes towards a project that's going to succeed, and to, you know, a person or organisation that's in a position to actually complete that project. Yes, but again, I wouldn't be providing overall financial position information, which would mean I wouldn't apply for the grant. Yeah, so I guess that's my submission. Yeah, I do wonder if there's another way that we can achieve the outcomes without sort of having to require that from individuals. Yeah. Anyway, open to questions.
Thank you, Emma. There's a couple of questions. I've just got one first. Just, I guess because this is a fund of public money and there's a great deal of public accountability that comes with all sorts of aspects of public funding, how would you deem that accountability would happen if it was just a declaration from an applicant saying they couldn't afford a project? How could we as elected members still confirm to our community that actually public money is being used appropriately and those kind of things without some of those other checks and balances?
Yeah, there's a degree of trust in that, and sort of having a statement, even one, you know, declared through a justice of the peace or something quite official. Yeah, it's just how you would else achieve the outcomes without, you know, requiring someone to have an accountant and an auditor and informing people about, you know, what they earn in a year and how they fund their life. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And some of the grant applicants only want a very small amount of help. So if someone with a tree, for instance, might only need $500 for some work. Yeah, whereas employing an accountant or an auditor was definitely more than $500 for that. Yeah. So I guess it's also maybe considering the amount of the grant as well. So if you're going over, you know, quite a substantial sum, then asking for more detail and that sort of thing from someone, whereas a smaller grant, yeah, not sort of looking too much of having that detail there behind, yeah, someone's financial position.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Emma, for your presentation. Emma, around the financials, would you consider like something like a financial referee, like just say a letter from your bank to say that you're, you know, got finances or something like that?
I've never had that before, so I'm not sure if banks provide that sort of information. You can provide a screenshot of your accounts, your financial statement. but again, it's providing information into a public realm that's kind of personal, private stuff. It's sort of almost controlled by the Privacy Act. That level of detail about an individual. So I'm not that comfortable with that. Even providing that information.
So even if the details of, like your bank account were kept, confidential, just having somebody sort of like as a guarantor, well, not a guarantor, but just somebody as a referee.
Not sure who would be a referee. I'm not sure banks provide that service. It's just.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I'm not sure how this would work practically.
Okay,
is my answer there.
Thank you. That's fine.
Councillor Barrett.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Emma, for bringing us your perspectives here. Wanted to follow up too, just around your concerns around disclosure, and whether there might be cases where limited disclosure would be acceptable. So, for instance, if the disclosure was only to the funding decision makers rather than a full public, would that in any way remedy your concern?
It's a bit better that way, but it's also the practicality of providing the information. So using the words in the draft policy, getting an accountant and an auditor, and I just wouldn't do that because I don't need that in my personal finances. So to spend $500 plus to apply for a grant, I wouldn't do it.
Understood. Thank you. If I can.
And just your answer about with the disclosing information to the grant committee and not to the public. Previously I've provided records to sort of prove that we've used the money appropriately, which include invoices and receipts, and also accounts statements from our bank statements. And I went through and I line by line blanked out anything that wasn't relevant to the fund before I submitted it. Right. So I have done that previously, given information to the decision makers.
Great, thanks.
So that part is fine.
Great, thanks, Emma. That's really been helpful, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Emma. Your 10 minutes is up now, but thank you for making the time to speak to us today.
Thank you. Cheers.
Our next submission is on page 38 from Environment Network Manawatu, and we have got Helen and Selwyn online. I won't need to go through the structure of the submissions. You're both very familiar with that, so you can take your submission as read and use your 10 minutes how you wish, and you're able to start when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Kia ora, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Helen King, and I am the Communications and Events person at Environment Network Manawatu, and I'm partnered here by Selwyn York, who is a member of our management committee. Thank you very much for reading and considering our submission around the draft support and funding policy, and just a couple of things that we would like to talk to here and have some clarification around as well. Just to give you as well to start with a really brief update on ENM, as noted in our submission, we are the Environment Hub for the Manawatu region, and we work with 60 member groups throughout the Manawatu catchment with varied environmental interests. We are a rapidly expanding organisation as well. Over the last year, our activities and our budgets have almost trebled. We work with two significant collectives, which are the Source to Sea Collective, which has been involved, and you will be familiar with, the Palmy Plastics Pollution Challenge project, and more recently, the Ruahine Kiwi Habitat Restoration project. And we also work with the Manawatu Food Action Network, who are part of the organisation and have significant interest and input and conversations around high security in the city as well. Just to talk a little bit to some of the things within the submission, I just want to talk to the point around confirming the decision-making process to lease council-owned land for community purposes, which we are in support of in the streamlining of these processes. Just wanting to note here again that we are an expanding organisation with the projects that we are taking on, and we're gaining 3 more staff in the new year as well in a very small building, and we have had to my understanding, I am new to this role, 9 weeks in, conversations with the council with the goal of creating an Enviro hub, and we look forward to realising and exploring this goal over the next few years more as we expand and our role expands as well. Just to go to the next poignant point, which is around the possibility of establishing a process to enter a formalised partnership with sector leads outside a contestable process and to be funding out of the strategic priority grants budget. Again, we are in strong support of this idea, and particularly would be in support of an environmental lead if this so comes around. And we would obviously be excited and interested in being the possibility of that environmental lead too, because we believe that our connections with the majority of the sustainability and environment-led based organisations in the region puts us in a positive, strong position to do this. And we would enjoy the opportunity to engage in more robust discussions and relationships with the council around our groups and who we are and what we do as well. What we do wish to seek clarification on, if this process does go forward and the decision is made to do this, is how the funding will be transitioned under the new arrangement, because we are strongly of the view that these contracts should not be at the detriment to any other eligible organisations that apply to contestable funding. The last point I really want to touch on is around the Environmental Initiatives Fund, which I'm not sure if listening people here are very familiar with, but the Environmental Initiatives Fund is administered by E&M, and it is money from Palmerston North City Council. And we administer small grants on a year-round basis and a larger contestable funding round in February. And we are obviously feeling very positive about this being put in our hands and enjoying the opportunity to distribute the fund as this useful mechanism for developing relationships. We are just wondering, you know, under the new arrangement, how this will transition. We are very much in favour of keeping the fund as we are distributing it right now, and just some clarification around that within this would be superb as well. Selwyn, do you have anything to add to my little monologue there? And thank you very much indeed for listening. We very much enjoyed, and I know I speak personally as well, and the organisation as well, at reading and submitting to this support and funding policy, which we believe is a really good realignment in direction for where we're going. And I particularly like to acknowledge the range of funding that the council offers to support the different groups and different organisations in the city. It is phenomenal. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. There's a couple of questions. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Selwyn. Just wanted to ask a question around the Environmental Initiatives Fund that you touched on, Helen. Could you give us a sense of how much demand you're experiencing for that fund, and if you have any sense of the trend in demand?
Last year was our first year administering the fund, and I cannot off the top of your head tell me how many projects we did fund, but I believe it was around 9, some smaller, some larger, some, you know, around the $500 range, some bigger projects which were involving, I believe, some trailblazing and making pathways and things like that. We
message is 3007.
Sorry? Oh, gosh.
Sorry, computer talking to me. Apologies for that. I'll mute
myself. Gosh. So we're doing a lot more communications work around it this year now that we've established our processes and so on and so forth. But we feel pretty clear that demand is there.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Helen and Selwyn. Helen, we heard from Palmerston North Community Services Council this morning that they have a number of different funding arrangements with the City Council that all have to be reported on and all come up for renewal at different times. And so they saw an advantage of the partnership agreement with sector leads as enabling a bit more streamlining of that process. Is Environment Network Manawatu in the same situation?
With our different funding streams with council?
Yes.
We have, in our last SPG, my understanding, again, new to the role, so please don't quote me if I'm wrong, is that we had separate funding for our different projects. So, for example, Source to Sea had a different set of funding. ENM's core work had a set of funding, and the Environmental Initiatives Fund was something differently funded as well. So almost, you know, all that money come from council, but 3 areas we had to report on. So yes, for us, that is an awful lot of reporting that we're currently having to do, and streamlining that process would obviously be a favourable thing for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Helen and Selwyn. There's no further questions. Thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Right, councillors, we're waiting for our next submitter, who's just arriving. So our next submission is on page 13. It is from Te Ha o Hineahu One, Palmerston North Women's Health Collective. Jean has just joined us online, so Jean, do you need a moment to get yourself sorted, or are you ready now?
Sorted, you mean?
Yes, the connection's a little bit shaky. Perhaps if you turn off your video, it might help the audio.
Is that better?
That's great. So you obviously are very familiar with the submission process. You can take your submission as read and you're able to start when you're ready. Thank you.
Okay. Kia ora koutou. Thanks for this opportunity, and we are one group that is very appreciative of the support that we've had, particularly through our times of funding crisis in the last few years. So that certainly made me more focused on funding. I think really what I mainly want to talk to you about is focusing on the small grants and also the principles that you're applying. And I do raise the whole issue of equity, the equity principle, which the funding policy is based on in many ways, I think. So I just think you need to consider equity in slightly broader terms. So equity in terms of what the City Council is providing to groups, but also equity in terms of the funding groups are getting from other places, because some groups in our sector are better funded than others, and also equity in terms of the community, in terms of need, and I guess those groups that are particularly addressing equity need in terms of essential free services is important to be considered also. In terms of the small grants, I think the point I was also making is about flexibility. Flexibility is really important depending on what's going on with different groups. I was a bit concerned about changes to the small grants in terms of being more specific about if groups are getting some support, such as being in council housing, becoming a lesser priority, and also changing the amount to 10,000 at the top level. And I'm just wondering whether that means that there's going to be a smaller number of groups and more missing out. And I just think one of the great things about the Community Development Small Grants Fund was that most groups applying would all get part of the pie, and I think that was actually really quite a really good base in terms of that particular funding stream. So I guess that's basically what I want to say. So are there any questions?
Thank you for those comments, Jean. First question is from Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Jean, for speaking to your submission. My question arises from the written submission that you've provided, and you close that. The closing of that says, "We are, however, not convinced that the policy currently captures all the principles and guidelines that are important." And I just wanted to understand, is that just summing up what you've outlined in the submission, or are there other specific examples where you feel that there are principles or guidelines that have been missed?
I think pretty much what I've covered was my main thinking. Whether there's other principles also, there may well be. I'm not sure what other submitters are raising.
Great, thanks for clarifying that, Madam Chair.
Councillors, are there any other questions for Jean? No further questions. Thank you, Jean, for making time for us today.
My pleasure.
Councillors, our next submission is from the Manawatu Tenants Union. This is page 67, and we've got Ben Schmidt here to speak to that. So Ben, you can take your submission as read, and you can start when you're ready.
Morena koutou, thank you for this opportunity to submit. Just wanted to briefly comment that we broadly do support this policy, and I think it's great to see a policy that brings a lot of these different funding streams into one place. It is accessible and has some common purpose through that. We do, however, have some recommendations and concerns around it where this can be further improved, which we've included in our submission. Really, that's around making sure that the sector lead organisations are clearly defined and that they're not, and that is not coming detriment to other organisations' funding. Also, the small grants accessible, it still remains accessible, and just as much to one organisation whether they're receiving council support to another that may not be, because that is a very large part of our community sector here in Palmerston North, and also suggesting some further improvements to the some of the community-led initiatives. I would also note that this has really, there's been similar threads throughout a lot of these submissions from community organisations such as PNCSC, Palmerston North Women's Health Collective, E&M and the Stomach on some of these matters that we're raising. Happy to take any questions though.
Thank you, Ben. First question is from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Ben, for your submission. My question is around point 8 in your submission, where you talk about the need for further definition of what a sector lead organisation is. Can you share what you or MTU thinks a sector lead organisation is?
So the question, first of all, we agree that having sector leads is a really good thing to have in place and have more secure funding for those. The obvious areas would be, for example, arts, environment, community, possibly multicultural as well. However, without definition, I mean, you could easily argue, would that include, say, the Housing Advice Centre as the sector lead for housing in Palmerston North, include the Age Concern, Age Friendly or Grey Power as sector lead for aged communities, Margaret for the Rainbow community. So we think the concept of sector leads is really good, but if we're talking about having dedicated funding in place, the council needs to consider what are the boundaries going to be of that, and how is that going to be clearly explained and communicated to people, because many different sectors with organisations that are leading their own space in Palmerston North. Does that answer your question or help?
Yes, well, it's helpful because I think this is a point that other people have raised in their submissions, and it's something that isn't quite clear in the consultation document. So just trying to get an idea of what different submitters think of it as a concept. So if I were to summarise your answer, would it be fair to say that you support the idea, but it's not clear how that would be defined, and you've given us some examples of possible things to consider?
That'd be a fair summary.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Next question is from Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just, kia ora, Ben. Just with your response to Councillor Johnson in regards to some of those community sector leads, depending on how we break each sector down, for example, we have Environment Manawatu as a network to head up potentially environment issues. Your suggestion, just with housing, using housing advice as a suggested possible lead, could you see that maybe some of the lead organisations we don't have in place currently, and maybe the initiative to form a network in that sector to be a community lead? I just would like your maybe some thoughts into that space.
Okay, thanks. So, first of all, just to clear, the example of Housing Advice Centre was just an example. I'm not quite sure how to best answer that question, because there's so many areas across Palmerston North which could be considered smaller or larger sectors and have their own organisation working in that area or representative groups. It's sort of like how long is a piece of string, to be honest. And so the council really, you need to decide where you're going to set those boundaries, because there's a whole range of groups that could be coming under that. If you wanted to rephrase that question, I'm happy to give that another go.
I value your response and your feedback to that. Thank you, Ben. Kia ora, Chair.
Thank you, Ben. There's no further questions for you, so thank you for making the time to submit to us today. We don't have any other submitters online. We've had to do a little bit of rejigging with some times, and unfortunately some have no longer been able to make it. So the final consideration of the submissions that we've heard both today and obviously the written submissions we've received will be at the Planning and Strategy Committee meeting on Wednesday, 9th of March. And so that will be also a time to ask of any questions to staff and engage in debate then. So moving on now to item 7, the proposed plan change J, Mass University Turitea Historic Area, and we've got Michael coming to speak to that. Page 93.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll largely take the memo as read. I'll probably just cover off around recommendation 1, though, just to provide a bit of context. The recommendation is to adopt the private plan change request. The committee may recall back in June there was another private plan change request that was received by council, and the recommendation as part of that process was to accept the plan change, and that meant that that plan change was notified, and the cost for processing that plan change was met by the developer and will continue to be met by the developer. In this case, the recommendation is to adopt. It's another option under the RMA, and there's a few reasons for that officer recommendation. The first is that there's some significant public good element as part of this plan change, given that it's a heritage-related process. And it also applies to publicly accessible and publicly owned land as well. Massey is also a strategic partner of the council, and I think one of the other points as well is that a lot of the costs for this plan change have largely already been met by the applicant. So there's a technical report that's the basis for the Section 32 assessment for this plan change, and a lot of the heavy lifting for the process has already been undertaken by Massey. And given the discrete nature of the plan change and the fact that they've done a lot of pre-consultation and engagement with parties that are likely to want to be engaged in this process already and have already made some changes to their proposal to give effect to that feedback, I think a lot of the input as part of the public process is likely going to be pretty discrete too and pretty minimal. So the cost for administering the process going forward isn't anticipated to be very significant at all and possibly quite minor. So I just wanted to, head that off. And other than that, I'm available for questions.
Thanks, Michael. First question from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Michael. My question is about the costs. Can you put a figure on the cost to council of adopting this?
I can't. A typical private plan change application, for context, we've got a lodgement fee of $20,000 to process a plan change. We haven't processed anything small of this scale that I'm aware of. The Chief Planning Officer may have some input on that, but I've processed other small private plan changes before at another council, and we're talking about a couple of $1,000s, but it depends really on the number of submissions that come through and what the planning response is going to be. That's really where the cost is going to be, and the administration of the hearing. If there is going to be one, it may be possible that there isn't going to be a hearing if there's some general agreement and no hearing is necessary, and we have had experiences of that in recent times. So, yeah.
Because I noticed that you have said yes to is the cost for this included in budgets. So are we planning to meet this from normal operational budgets? Are we? Staff time effectively is what you're talking about?
Yes, so I guess there is budget in the LTP to process plan changes, and that would typically be for council-initiated plan changes. And under this process, if the council was to adopt the plan change, then it would be in the capacity of a council-initiated plan change.
So given that we've got our other council plan changes that we're trying to expedite, is adopting this going to delay those?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Michael. Michael, the biggest risk is around how many submitters there would be. So this sort of plan, I can't imagine have you got any feeling that there'd be any great opposition out there?
We've had meetings with Massey University as I've been preparing this private plan change application, and we've encouraged them to be engaging with parties that we think would most likely be interested, and they have engaged with all of those parties, and they've reached out to various heritage groups, iwi groups, and the like, and Heritage New Zealand as well. I would imagine that those are the sorts of parties that would engage on this sort of process. Another thing that I've noted in the memo as well is that the RMA now allows councils to look at limited notified plan changes. This could be a plan change that could be explored for that process, which would potentially limit the scope of submissions. But given that there may be some wider public interest and submissions are likely to be low anyway, there may not be any need to do that, but it is an option that we can consider, and a notification assessment wouldn't be needed to sort of justify whether or not that approach is pursued.
Yep. Thank you.
Councillors, are there any further questions? Thank you, Michael. There's no further questions. So I'm happy to move the recommendations, seconded by Councillor Hancock. I'll just read through those quickly. One, that the Massey University Turitea Historic Area Private Plan Change request by Massey University, included in Attachment 1 to the memorandum titled Proposed Plan Change J, Massey University Turitea Historic Area, presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on 8th December 2021, be adopted pursuant to Section 25(2)A, Part 2 of the First Schedule of the Resource Management Act 1991. And 2, that the Massey University Turitea Historic Area Plan Change request by Massey University be notified in accordance with Section 26, Part 2 of the First Schedule of the Resource Management Act 1991. And I'll open up for comments. First up is the Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councillors, I think we need to support this. Massey are a strategic partner of us. Councillor Johnson and Councillor Beattie teased out the questions that I was interested in if we adopt, and the risk is relatively low in terms of cost, timing, and even submitters. I think they've done quite a bit of work in the background. This Turitea oval or historical area is quite special and unique, certainly for the city, but also from a university perspective. So we've seen some great work that they've done with the Sir Geoffrey Perrin building. The old refectory, which I had the pleasure of going through last week, is absolutely amazing. So I understand they want to do that with other sites around the oval. So I think we need to support this, plus it's supporting one of our strategic partners. So I hope you endorse it. Thank you.
Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm also going to support it and actually raise the point around university campuses around the world that are renowned and have their historic buildings protected, create a lot of value not only for the campus and the city but also for the nation as far as profiling, and something as special and unique as this I think would bring a lot of benefit to the city as a whole, and yeah, for the cost, which is not a major at all, is probably a minor in the greater scheme of things. For the benefit and the value that it does to protect this area, I'm happy to lead out on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there anyone else wishing to comment? Great, I will invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to the committee work schedule on page 187, and I will pass over to David to provide any comments or updates.
Cool. Just before I talk on the committee work schedule, Michael and John and Tara, just before you leave this, I just wanted to make the committee aware of some recent changes in the planning team. So Michael Doondam has been appointed principal planner. So that's a new role that we've established. So it's a senior technical lead in the planning team that will lead the district plan change work. And Jono Ferguson-Pye has been appointed the city planning manager. So that's managing the district plan team, the urban design team, the climate change team, and transport planning and GIS. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So you've seen a lot of Michael in the last 12 months, and Jono was in the acting role. But so yeah, Michael is in that principal technical lead. Jono was with the planning team throughout the course of the last sectional district plan review and has spent some time up in infrastructure and has come back to join us in strategic planning. And also just want to note, Tara has joined the planning team as well, and she'll be working on the Massey University work. So Tara was employed as a graduate initially, and is now in a permanent planning role in the strategic planning team. So just sort of bring the committee to, or raise those appointments with the committee.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, and in terms of the work schedule, nothing specific other than, as it was touched on earlier, the support and funding policy, the deliberations on the submissions and the recommendations for changes to that policy will come to the March committee.
Are there any questions on the work schedule? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question around item 12, the instructing resolution there had requested a 6-month or less turnaround there, and just wanted to understand if how consistent that is with the TVC 2022. Are we expecting something in the April timeframe?
Yeah, we can. Listen to the chair. We can confirm at the February meeting, but I'm comfortable that given that the resolution was report back in 6 months, that it is that's completed within 6 months.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Just, I guess a comment on that was we did talk about that in the agenda meeting, some of the TBCs, and agreed that for the February meeting we should have some dates for those once David's been able to look at the workloads in the new year and those kind of things. So hopefully those are all tidied up then. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in item 10, which is newly added after our minutes been approved around the Kohanga proposal for Opi Place, to line on the table, I know that we had some sort of convention around when we have something lying on the table that there would be some intention around the next steps rather than just leaving it on the table. And can I just clarify, was there any intent from that committee meeting for it to go to a workshop or to seek other information to bring it back?
Yeah, so it was the explanation for why it was lying on the table was to get further information, and it specifically was to talk to Ngāti Hiniatu around their I guess plans, their desires, and also Kāinga Ora's housing plan were the two pieces of information that officers were going to pull together. So basically once we've got that information, I imagine it'll be a memo or something to lift it off the table, including that information. That's how we've done it in the past.
Okay, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Great, no further questions. So I will move the committee resolve that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated December 2021, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? And I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. So that concludes our business today. Nō reira, na mihi nui kia koutou, ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And we are now finished for the morning. We'll be back here in the chamber at 1.